The smell of ozone and burnt insulation didn't just linger in the air. It felt like it was growing inside my lungs, a grey fungus of the deep desert night. I found Adam in the main server room of the Goldstone Deep Space Communications Complex, but he wasn't working. He was pinned to the floor by an invisible weight, his body locked in a rigid, agonizing arch. His eyes, God, his eyes, were wet marbles of terror, twitching in rhythmic, jagged snaps as they tracked something moving across the ceiling. There was nothing there but peeling paint and dead fluorescent tubes, yet Adam followed it with the frantic desperation of a cornered animal watching its predator. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. He just vibrated with a low, subharmonic frequency that made my teeth ache. Security dragged him out on a gurney 20 minutes later, his gaze still glued to the rafters, leaving me alone with the silence of the Mojave and the metallic tang of his fear. My supervisor, a man named Miller whose face looked like it had been carved from a block of dry, salted leather, didn't offer an explanation. He just handed me a laminated card, its edges yellowed and cracked, and pointed toward the pitch-black corridor leading to the restricted Annex C. He told me I was the new facilities tech for the dead zone, and if I wanted to keep my pension, I'd follow the card better than Adam did. The hallway to Annex C was a tomb of cold concrete and buzzing light. The flickering fluorescence cast long, stuttering shadows that seemed to detach from the walls, dancing in the corner of my vision like oil slicks on water. The air felt thin, recycled 1,000 times until it tasted of dust and ancient static. I looked down at the card in my shaking hand. The rules were printed in a sharp, clinical font that felt at odds with their utter insanity. Rule 1. Do not enter room 19 between the hours of 2:10 a.m. and 2:25 a.m. Rule 2. If the intercom speakers activate, do not respond, even if the voice identifies as a family member or a superior. Rule 3. Maintain a 3-foot distance from the primary equipment rack at all times to avoid static entanglement. Rule 4. Do not look directly at the shadows cast by the antennas during a lunar transit. And finally, Rule 5. If the status light panel on the primary console displays more than 34 active lights, immediately lock the exterior vault of Annex C from the outside and flee the complex. Do not stop for security. Do not look back at the windows. Annex C hadn't seen a human soul in decades, or at least that's what the thick layer of grey grime on the floor suggested. It was a cavernous space, filled with the skeletal remains of 1970s-era computing banks and massive, rusted reels of magnetic tape. The silence here wasn't empty. It was heavy, a physical pressure pushing against my eardrums like the weight of a deep-sea trench. As I approached room 19, the flickering overhead lights died entirely, replaced by the sickly, rhythmic pulse of a single emergency strobe. It bathed the hallway in a strobe light nightmare of red and black. I checked my watch. 1:58 a.m. The dread was a cold lump of lead in my stomach, dragging me toward that heavy steel door. I could feel the building breathing around me, the pipes groaning with a sound that mimicked a human moan, the walls vibrating with the distant, thrumming roar of the massive Goldstone antennas outside, reaching out into the void to catch whispers from the stars. But here, in the rotting heart of Annex C, it felt like something from the void had reached back and was currently scratching at the underside of the floorboards. I stood outside room 19, listening. There was a sound coming from behind the door, a soft, wet clicking, like 1,000 insects moving in unison. It was the sound of something calculating, something ancient and hungry that spoke in the language of binary and bone. I remembered Adam's eyes, the way they had tracked that invisible horror across the ceiling, and I realized with a jolt of pure, electric terror that I was now the only thing standing between that room and the rest of the world. The fluorescent light above me gave one final, violent pop, showering the floor in glass shards, leaving me in total darkness. The only thing I could see was the faint, ghostly green glow emanating from the gap beneath the door of room 19. It pulsed like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, a beckoning light from a dead world. I leaned against the cold metal of the wall, the laminated card clutched so tight the plastic dug into my palm, and I waited for the clock to strike 2:10. The air grew colder, the scent of rotting ozone intensified, and for a moment, I thought I heard a voice whisper my name from the vent above my head, a voice that sounded exactly like Adam's, if Adam's throat had been filled with ground glass and vacuum. My flashlight beam cut through the dark like a blade, revealing the jagged peeling of the hallway wallpaper, which looked like strips of dead skin. Every few feet, a speaker grill set into the ceiling hissed with a burst of white noise, a rhythmic, oceanic surge that felt less like electronics and more like a heavy, labored breathing. I kept my eyes on the floor, avoiding the ceiling at all costs. I could feel the weight of room 19 ahead of me, a gravity well of wrongness that seemed to warp the very geometry of the hallway. The walls felt like they were leaning in, the ceiling dropping lower with every step I took. I was a facilities technician, a man of wrenches and circuit breakers, but as I stood in the flickering red glow of the emergency lights, I felt like a priest entering a desecrated temple. The rules in my hand weren't just instructions, they were a containment ritual. The clock on the wall clicked forward, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the stagnant air. 2:05 a.m. 5 minutes until the window of the void opened, and I was trapped in the dark with whatever had broken Adam's mind. The silence began to scream, a high-pitched ringing that vibrated in my skull, and I realized the buzzing wasn't coming from the lights. It was coming from inside the walls themselves, a million voices whispering in a language of static and rot. Miller didn't look at me. He couldn't. His eyes were fixed on the corner of his desk, staring at a stack of manila folders as if they were headstones. The desk lamp was the only thing fighting back the gloom of the office, casting a pool of harsh, jaundiced light that made the shadows behind him look like they were reaching out to stroke his hair. He looked decades older than he had when I clocked in 8 hours ago. His hands, usually steady enough to calibrate a multi-million-dollar satellite dish, were trembling so violently he had to interlock his fingers just to keep them from rattling the desk. He slid a piece of plastic toward me. It was a laminated card, yellowed at the edges, the kind of thing you'd see in a dive bar's kitchen listing the temperature for chicken. But this wasn't a menu. At the top, in a font that looked like it had been typed on a ghost's underwood, were the words, Annex C, Room 19, Operational Protocols. I looked at the card, then back at Miller. My tongue felt like a piece of dry leather. I asked him about Adam. I asked him what happened to the man I'd shared coffee with just 3 hours ago. Miller's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek like a trapped insect. He told me Adam was being transported to a specialized facility in Nevada. He didn't say hospital. He said facility. He told me Adam's eyes were still open, still tracking that invisible line across the ceiling, and that the doctors couldn't get his heart rate below 140 beats per minute. It was as if Adam's body was trying to run a marathon while his mind was trapped in a photograph. Then Miller stood up, his shadow stretching across the ceiling like a spilled ink blot, and told me that if I wanted to keep my pension, I'd take the graveyard shift in Annex C alone. The walk to Annex C was a descent into a specific kind of Mojave purgatory. The Goldstone Complex is a sprawling graveyard of white steel and wire, giant dishes tilted toward the stars like open mouths begging for a drop of water. But Annex C was different. It sat nearly a mile away from the main cluster, a squat, windowless bunker of reinforced concrete that looked like it had been designed to keep something in rather than keep the weather out. The desert air was cold, a biting, dry chill that felt like it was trying to suck the moisture straight out of my pores. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the alkali flats and the distant, rhythmic groan of the massive GDS-CC antennas as they pivoted in the dark. I reached the heavy steel door of the annex. It didn't have a handle, just a keypad that looked like it had been melted and reshaped. I swiped my badge, punched in the code Miller had whispered to me, and the door hissed open with a sound like a dying gasp. The interior was a cathedral of rot and outdated technology. The air smelled of ozone, stagnant water, and the copper tang of old blood. The lights were dim, flickering with a localized, rhythmic pulse that made the hallway seem to breathe. I pulled out the laminated card. My flashlight beam trembled as it hit the text. I needed to know what the rules were before I stepped another foot into that concrete throat. Rule 1. Do not enter room 19 between the hours of 2:10 a.m. and 2:25 a.m. If you are already inside when the window begins, sit on the floor, close your eyes, and do not hum. The silence must be absolute. I checked my watch. 1:45 a.m. I had time, but the weight of the rule pressed against my chest. Why 15 minutes? Why the prohibition on humming? It felt like a rule designed for a predator that hunted by vibration, something that lived in the gaps between seconds. Rule 2. The intercom and wall-mounted speakers are disconnected from the main grid. If they activate, do not respond. If a voice identifies itself as a member of the complex staff, do not respond. If the voice identifies itself as you, leave the room immediately and do not return for 24 hours. My skin crawled. The thought of my own voice coming out of a dead speaker, echoing in this hollow tomb, made my stomach turn. I looked up at the rusted mesh of a speaker mounted near the ceiling. It looked like a clogged ear, filled with decades of dust and static. I could almost hear the white noise beginning to coil inside it, a necrotic hiss waiting for a reason to speak. Rule 3. Maintain the equipment panel in room 19. Ensure all analog gauges remain in the green. If a gauge enters the red, do not attempt to calibrate it manually. Use the long-handled wooden pole kept in the corner to nudge the dial back. Do not touch the metal housing with your bare skin. I pictured the static charge that could necessitate a wooden pole. Not electricity. Something else. Something that could jump from the machine to the marrow of a man's bones. I thought of Adam, paralyzed and staring. Maybe he'd touched the housing. Maybe whatever was inside those machines had flowed into him like black ink into a glass of water. Rule 4. If you feel a sudden, localized drop in temperature, or if the smell of wet earth fills the room, ignore the peripheral movement in the shadows. Focus on the status lights. The lights are your only anchor. The lights. That was the core of it. I looked down at the final rule, the one that Miller had underlined twice with a shaky, black pen. Rule 5. Count the status lights on the main equipment panel every 10 minutes. There should be exactly 34. If you count 35, turn off your flashlight and wait. If you count more than 35, lock the annex doors from the outside, drive to the main gate, and do not look in the rearview mirror. The containment has failed. I tucked the card into my breast pocket, right over my heart. It felt like a lead weight. I began to walk down the long, tapering hallway toward room 19. The walls were lined with conduit that vibrated with a low-frequency thrum, a sound that wasn't heard so much as felt in the soles of my feet. It was the sound of a heart beating in a chest made of lead. The shadows here were thick, oily things that didn't behave the way shadows should. They seemed to linger a second too long after I moved my light, peeling themselves off the concrete like wet velvet. I reached the door to room 19. It was a slab of heavy iron, pitted with rust and sealed with a manual throw lever. I gripped the lever, the cold of the metal biting through my work gloves. I took a breath, the air tasting of static and old, forgotten things. I heaved the lever up. The screech of metal on metal was a scream in the silence of the annex. I stepped inside. The room was a cavern of archaic tech. Rows of server racks that looked like they belonged in the Cold War era hummed with a sickly, green light. Large, circular analog gauges lined the walls, their needles quivering like the whiskers of a nervous animal. In the center of the room was the panel. It was a vertical slab of brushed aluminum, peppered with small, incandescent bulbs. They glowed with a pale, rhythmic amber. I stood there, the silence of the room folding in around me. It was 2:05 a.m. 5 minutes until the dead zone. I moved to the panel and began to count, my finger tracing the air in front of each light. 1, 2, 3. My voice sounded small and brittle in the vast, echoing space. I reached 34. Exactly 34. The amber glow reflected off the lenses of my glasses, casting twin orbs of light into the darkness behind me. I backed away from the panel, searching for the wooden pole Miller had mentioned. I found it leaning in the corner, a 6-foot length of ash that looked like it had been salvaged from an old tool shed. I gripped it, my knuckles white. I looked at the clock on the wall. 2:09 a.m. I sat down on the floor, my back against the cold concrete of the far wall, just as the rule dictated. I clicked off my flashlight. The darkness that rushed in was absolute. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a physical weight, a suffocating shroud that pressed against my eyes and filled my lungs. I squeezed my eyes shut, even though it made no difference. Then, the window opened. At exactly 2:10 a.m., the atmosphere in the room changed. The hum of the servers didn't stop, but it shifted in pitch, descending into a guttural, wet sound, like something heavy being dragged through mud. The air grew frigid. My breath came out in ragged, visible plumes that I couldn't see but could feel brushing against my face. And then came the scratching. It started at the edges of the room, a dry, frantic sound of nails on concrete. It moved across the ceiling, circling the spot where I sat today. I wanted to scream. I wanted to hum a tune, any tune, just to drown out the sound of whatever was skittering above me in the dark. But I remembered the rule. The silence must be absolute. I clamped my jaw shut so hard my teeth ached. The scratching stopped. In its place came a wet, heavy thud, as if something large had dropped from the ceiling to the floor near the equipment panel. Then came the sound of a voice. It wasn't a human voice. It was a construct of static and distorted frequencies, a jagged, serrated sound that tore through the quiet. It didn't speak words at first. It made the sound of a dial being turned between stations. A burst of jazz music. A snippet of a weather report from 1974. A woman laughing. Then, it settled into a low, rhythmic moan that vibrated the very floorboards beneath me. I felt the vibration in my teeth, in my ribs. It was a language of rot, a communication from a void that didn't understand the concept of a soul. I sat there, frozen, a prisoner of the clock. Every second felt like an hour spent in the company of a ghost. I could hear it breathing now, a ragged, wet wheeze that smelled of old earth and ozone. It was close. I could feel the heat radiating off it, a sickly, feverish warmth that didn't belong in the cold of the room. It was standing right in front of me. I could hear the click of its joints as it shifted its weight. I didn't open my eyes. I didn't breathe. I waited for the silence to return. And then, the speaker on the wall crackled. A spark of blue static illuminated the room for a fraction of a second, and in that flash, I saw it. Not a man. Not a shadow. It was a distortion in the air, a ripple of jagged geometry that looked like a hole torn in the world. It was standing over the equipment panel, its non-existent hands hovering over the amber lights. The speaker hissed. A voice, clear and hauntingly human, broke the silence. Is someone there? Please. This is Lincoln Bridges. I'm with the Kepler 6 crew module. We've been out here for, God, I don't know how long. 34 years? Is anyone listening? Please, respond. We are so cold. The voice was filled with a desperate, bone-deep terror. It sounded so real, so fragile. I felt my hand twitch toward my radio. I wanted to help him. I wanted to tell him we heard him. But then I remembered. Kepler 6. I'd read about that in the archives during my orientation. Kepler 6 was a private mission that had been scrapped in the 90s after a hangar fire killed the entire crew before they ever left the ground. Lincoln Bridges was the pilot. He died in 1993. The voice on the speaker wasn't a man. It was the thing in the room, using a dead man's name as a hook, trying to pull me into the dark. I kept my mouth shut. I kept my eyes closed. I waited. Finally, the pressure in the room eased. The wet, heavy breathing receded. The skittering sound climbed back up the walls and vanished into the ductwork. I waited another minute, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I opened my eyes and clicked on my flashlight. The room was empty. The equipment panel was still there, the amber lights glowing steady and calm. I stood up, my legs shaking so badly I almost fell. I checked my watch. 2:26 a.m. The window was closed. I walked over to the panel, my breath hitching in my throat. I needed to count. I needed to know the containment was still holding. 1, 2, 3. I reached the bottom row. My heart stopped. 35. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. I counted again. Slower this time. 35. There was an extra light, a small, pulsing violet bulb that hadn't been there before. It sat at the very edge of the panel, looking like a bruise on the metal. My hand went to the wooden pole, but I stopped. Rule 5. If you count 35, turn off your flashlight and wait. I killed the light. I stood in the dark, the smell of wet earth growing stronger, more pungent. It smelled like a fresh grave. I waited for the violet light to vanish, for the world to make sense again. But as I stood there, a second light flickered on. Then a third. The amber lights were being drowned out by a rising tide of violet. 36. 37. The containment wasn't just failing. It was being torn open from the other side. And I was the only thing standing between the void and the rest of the world. 38. 39. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and something far more ancient. Something that smelled like the cold, wet earth of a fresh grave. Every time a new light pulsed on that equipment panel, the floor beneath my boots felt less like solid concrete and more like a thin scab over an infection that was finally about to burst. The amber status indicators were drowning in a rising tide of violet, a color that shouldn't exist in nature, a color that felt like a bruise on the back of my retinas. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in my ribs, hammering against the bone as I realized the containment wasn't just failing, it was being torn open from the other side. I remembered the voice. That was the real poison. It had happened only 2 nights prior, during that forbidden window between 2:10 and 2:25 a.m. I had been standing outside room 19, sweating through my technician's jumpsuit, clutching the laminated card of rules like it was a holy relic. Rule 2. Never answer the self-activating speakers. But when the static began, it didn't sound like electronic noise. It sounded like a wet, ragged breath. Then came the voice. It was Lincoln Bridges. He didn't sound like a ghost. He sounded like a man who had been screaming for 34 years and had finally found the strength to whisper. He said he was on the Kepler-6 crew module. He said it was dark and that the stars were blinking out one by one. He begged me to tell him if the Earth was still there. The terror hadn't truly set in until the next morning, when I sat in the dim light of the facility's archives, my hand shaking as I pulled up the digitized records of the 1991 Kepler-6 proposal. It was a phantom project, a private spaceflight initiative that had been cancelled before the first bolt was ever turned. There was no crew module. There was no deep space mission. And Lincoln Bridges, the man whose voice had vibrated through the rusted speakers of Annex C, had died in a hangar fire in 1993. I saw the obituary. I saw the photo of the charred wreckage. The transmission wasn't a signal from space. It was a signal from a grave that didn't exist, sent by a man who had been ashes for 3 decades. 41. 42. The violet lights were pulsing in rhythm with my own panic pulse. The equipment panel began to weep a black, oily substance that hissed as it touched the floor. I remembered the final rule. Lock the building and flee. I turned and ran. My boots slapped against the linoleum, the sound echoing through the jagged, empty hallways of Annex C. The emergency lights were flickering, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach for my ankles. I hit the heavy steel door of the annex and slammed the manual override, hearing the massive deadbolts thud into place with a finality that felt like a coffin lid closing. Outside, the Goldstone Desert was a vast, silent void under a moonless sky. I was met by 3 men in suits that looked too expensive for the desert heat, flanked by facility security. They didn't look surprised. They looked exhausted. One of them, a man with eyes as grey as static, told me the truth. The rules weren't just safety protocols. They were containment stages for a deep space anomaly, a localized tear in the fabric of what we consider reality. The entity, whatever was mimicking Bridges, wasn't just a signal. It was a predator that used sound to establish a tether. Adam, my coworker, had been the one to break the seal. During his shift, the voice had spoken to him, and in a moment of weak, human empathy, Adam had keyed his radio and spoken back. He had given the thing a bridge. Now, the anomaly was using the facility's own power to widen that bridge, to pull itself through the speakers and the screens and the very air of Room 19. The paralysis that had taken Adam wasn't physical. His mind was being used as a processor, his eyes forced to track the entity's movements in a dimension we couldn't see. The grey-eyed man handed me a screwdriver and a heavy brass key. The containment was at a terminal state. The only way to stop the bleed was to enter Room 19 during the active 2:16 AM window and pull the manual shunt, a physical breaker hidden behind a lead line panel. It had to be done manually. It had to be done by someone who had already heard the voice and survived the initial contact. It had to be me. Re-entering Annex C felt like walking into the throat of a colossal beast. The silence was absolute, yet my ears rang with a high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache. I reached Room 19 at exactly 2:15 AM. The door was humming. When I pushed it open, the geometry of the room felt wrong. The corners didn't meet at right angles anymore. The walls seemed to stretch toward a ceiling that vanished into a swirling vortex of violet static and necrotic shadows. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me. Derek. The voice didn't come from the speakers this time. It came from the air itself. It was Lincoln Bridges, but the voice was layered now, 1,000 versions of him speaking in a discordant, wet harmony. Derek, I know about the tuition, the voice whispered. I felt a cold spike of horror. My son's university bills, the debt I had been drowning in, the reason I had taken this godforsaken night shift in the first place. I can make the numbers disappear, Derek. I can make the world quiet. You don't have to pull the lever. Just stay here. Just look up. I saw the panel. It was vibrating so hard the screws were backing out on their own. I stumbled toward it, my vision blurring. The air felt like it was made of jagged glass. The entity began to read my vitals aloud, a rhythmic, mocking chant of my heart rate and my blood pressure, weaponizing my own biology against me. It told me my heart was going to stop. It told me my lungs were filling with vacuum. I reached the panel and jammed the screwdriver into the gap. The metal was burning hot, smelling of scorched hair and ancient dust. The psychological pressure was immense, a physical weight pushing me toward the floor, urging me to just lie down and look at the ceiling like Adam. I could see things up there now, shapes that looked like limbs made of frozen smoke, reaching down from the violet void. I pried the cover off. The manual shunt was a heavy iron lever, rusted and stubborn. "Derek, if you do this, he will never see you again," the voice shrieked, no longer bridges, but something hollow and howling. I didn't listen. I closed my eyes, screamed until my throat felt like it was tearing, and threw my entire weight onto the lever. The sound that followed was beyond human description. It was the sound of a world being unmade. A screeching feedback erupted that shattered every light bulb in the annex simultaneously. The physical geometry of the room snapped back into place with a violent, bone-jarring thud. I felt a sensation of something being severed, a tension that had been pulled taut for 34 years finally snapping. I woke up on the cold floor in total darkness. The violet was gone. The silence was no longer heavy. It was just the empty, hollow silence of a dead building. NASA didn't give me a medal. They gave me a non-disclosure agreement and a transfer to the day shift at a different complex. They spent 3 days welding the heavy steel door to Annex C shut, encasing the entire wing in 2 feet of reinforced lead and concrete. They told me it was decommissioned. I know better. They just buried the grave. Adam is still in the hospital. The doctors say his vitals are perfect, but he hasn't moved a muscle in months. He sits in his bed, his neck craned back, his eyes wide and unblinking, forever tracking something invisible that moves across the ceiling. I'm safe now, or so I tell myself. But every night, I find myself checking the clocks. I make sure I'm in a room with a TV or a radio, something to drown out the quiet. Because I know that somewhere out there, in the vast, reaching void between the stars, there is a man named Lincoln Bridges who is still waiting for an answer. And I know that whenever the clock strikes 2:16 a.m., if the room gets too quiet, I can still hear the faint, jagged sound of static beginning to breathe. The desert doesn't just get dark. It gets hungry. Out here at the Goldstone Deep Space Communications Complex, the night isn't a lack of light. It is a physical weight, a thick, velvet pressure that presses against the corrugated steel of the outbuildings until the rivets groan. I stood in the corridor of Annex C, my boots clicking against the linoleum with a sound like snapping dry bone. My flashlight beam was a weak, yellow needle stitching through the oppressive gloom. Every shadow in the corners looked like it was trying to peel itself off the wall. I kept my eyes on the equipment panel of room 19. I had been counting for 3 hours. The laminated card in my pocket felt like it was radiating heat through my uniform. Rule 5 was the one that kept me from swallowing. If you count more than 34 status lights on the equipment panel, lock the building and flee. Simple, pragmatic, terrifying. For the first 4 nights, there were 31. Steady, rhythmic pulses of amber and green that looked like the heartbeat of a sleeping god. On the 5th night, there were 32. On the 6th, 33. Tonight, the panel was a jagged constellation of wrongness. I counted them once, then twice. My breath hitched in my throat, tasting of recycled air and ozone. 34. The 34th light was a sickly, bruised purple. It didn't blink. It throbbed. I gripped the handle of my screwdriver so hard the plastic bit into my palm. I told myself it was a surge. I told myself the aging wiring was just bleeding current. But then, with a sound like a wet lung collapsing, a 35th light flickered into existence. It wasn't on the grid. It was burned into the metal casing itself, a pinprick of white light so intense it left a black streak on my retinas. The air in the hallway curdled. The silence of the Mojave was replaced by a low-frequency hum that vibrated in my molars. I didn't flee. I couldn't. My boots felt like they had been welded to the floor. Through the reinforced glass of room 19, the shadows began to distort, stretching toward the ceiling in ways that defied the single overhead bulb. Suddenly, the heavy door at the end of the hall hissed open. It wasn't an intruder. It was Miller, the site supervisor, followed by 2 men in tactical gear who didn't have names, only grim expressions and silenced carbines. Miller looked like he hadn't slept since the 90s. His skin was the color of curdled milk, and his eyes were bloodshot pits. He didn't ask me why I was still there. He just looked at the 35th light and let out a breath that sounded like a funeral shroud tearing. He told me the truth then, his voice a jagged whisper. The rules weren't for my safety. They were containment stages. The complex wasn't just listening to the stars. It had caught something. A signal that had found a way to become a physical infection. Adam, My coworker, who was currently paralyzed in a psych ward, hadn't just tripped. He had broken the silence. He had spoken back into his radio during the restricted window, and in doing so, he had given the thing on the other end a bridge. The 35th light meant the bridge was fully formed. The entity was no longer just a transmission. It was a tenant. Miller handed me a heavy, rusted iron key and pointed toward the manual shunt lever inside room 19. He told me the security teams couldn't go in. Their gear was too complex, too many circuits for the entity to hijack. I was just a technician with a screwdriver and a heartbeat. It had to be me. I looked at my watch. 2:12 a.m. The window was opening. I entered room 19 and the door slammed shut behind me, the locks engaging with the finality of a guillotine. The room was a landscape of high-contrast nightmare. The equipment racks were silhouettes that seemed to grow taller when I wasn't looking directly at them. The air was freezing, a dry, vacuum cold that sucked the moisture from my eyes. At 2:16 a.m., the silence broke. It didn't come from the speakers. It came from the walls, from the floor, from the very marrow of my bones. A voice, layered with the static of a billion miles of empty space. "Derek," it said. My name shouldn't have been in that room. The voice was Lincoln Bridges, or at least the thing wearing his vocal cords. It sounded like gravel spinning in a dryer. It told me it could hear my heart. It told me my pulse was 114 beats per minute and rising. It told me it knew about my son. It knew about the tuition payments I was behind on, the debt that kept me taking these graveyard shifts at the edge of the world. It promised me things. It told me that if I just let the 35th light burn, if I just walked away from the lever, the money would appear. It spoke of deep space caches, of lost private data streams that it could divert to my accounts. It wasn't a ghost. It was a predator using a dead man's voice as a lure. I reached for the metal panel covering the shunt. The surface was freezing, burning my skin with cryogenic intensity. The voice shifted. It wasn't pleading anymore. It was screaming. A jagged, electronic screech that felt like a hot wire being pushed into my ear canal. The geometry of the room began to buckle. The floor tilted at an impossible angle, and the ceiling seemed to descend, a vast, flat expanse of rotting grey matter. I saw Adam in my mind, his eyes tracking something invisible. I realized then that he wasn't looking at nothing. He was looking at the entity as it draped itself across the ceiling like a shroud. I jammed the screwdriver into the seam of the panel. The metal groaned, weeping a black, oily fluid that smelled like burnt hair. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped the tool. The voice was inside my skull now, whispering the names of people I had lost, imitating my mother's laugh, then distorting it into a digital howl. I pried the plate off. Behind it lay the manual shunt, a heavy, brass lever caked in decades of dust. I grabbed it. The room convulsed. The 35 lights on the panel outside began to strobing in a blinding, rhythmic pattern. "You will be alone in the dark," the voice hissed, no longer sounding like Lincoln Bridges, but like the vacuum itself. "You will never hear silence again." I threw my entire weight onto the lever. The sound that followed wasn't an explosion. It was a snap, like a tectonic plate breaking. A wave of white noise erupted from the speakers, a feedback loop so powerful it shattered the glass in the equipment racks. I felt a sensation of immense suction, as if the room were being emptied of its very existence. The shadows recoiled, snapping back into the corners like whipped dogs. The 35th light vanished. Then the 34th. The 33rd. By the time the lever hit the bottom of its arc, the room was silent. Truly silent. I slumped against the cooling metal of the racks, my lungs burning. The high-contrast shadows had returned to being just shadows. The crushing weight was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching emptiness. NASA didn't give me a medal. They didn't even give me a debrief. They sent in a welding crew at 4 a.m. I watched from the perimeter fence as they fused the heavy steel door of Annex C shut, burying the room and the shunt behind inches of hardened alloy. They told me I was being moved to the day shift at the main tracking station. No more lone patrols. No more Annex C. Adam is still in the facility in Ohio. They say he doesn't speak, doesn't eat unless is fed through a tube. He just lies there, his eyes wide, his pupils dilated to the size of quarters, tracking something that moves across the ceiling in a slow, rhythmic circle. He's still listening to the broadcast. I try to live a normal life. I pay the tuition. I sit in the sun. But the desert is still out there, and the stars are still screaming. I know that somewhere out there, in the vast, reaching void between the stars, there is a man named Lincoln Bridges who is still waiting for an answer. And I know that whenever the clock strikes 2:16 a.m., if the room gets too quiet, I can still hear the faint, jagged sound of static beginning to breathe. The air in the hallway leading to room 19 didn't just feel cold. It felt thin, like the atmosphere at the edge of the world where the oxygen gives way to the freezing indifference of the stars. My boots made a wet, heavy sound on the linoleum, a rhythmic thud that seemed to echo seconds after I stopped moving. The emergency strobes were failing. They didn't just blink, they shuddered, casting jagged, violent slivers of white light that cut the shadows into geometric shapes. In those brief flashes, the walls of Annex C looked like they were sweating black oil. The smell was worse than the silence. It was the scent of ozone mixed with something sweet and rotting, like an electrical fire in a morgue. I looked down at my watch. 2:15 a.m. The lamination on the rules card crinkled in my trembling hand. Rule 5 was no longer a warning. It was a death sentence written in red ink. 38 lights were screaming on the equipment panel through the reinforced glass of the observation booth. The containment was breathing. The anomaly wasn't just a signal anymore. It was a physical weight pressing against the door of room 19, trying to find a way to bleed into our reality. I could hear it through the heavy steel, a low, oscillating hum that vibrated in my teeth and made my vision blur. "Derek," the voice came again. It wasn't through a speaker this time. It was inside the marrow of my bones. I didn't answer. I remembered Adam. I remembered him slumped on the floor, his neck craned at an impossible angle, his pupils blown wide as he followed something invisible across the ceiling. He had spoken back. He had given the signal a bridge. I gripped the heavy screwdriver in my right hand, the cold metal biting into my palm, and reached for the heavy iron latch of the door. The clock struck 2:16 a.m. The moment I breached the seal, the world tilted 45 degrees to the left. The room didn't have a floor anymore. It had a shimmering, oily surface that reflected a sky that shouldn't exist. Above me, the ceiling of room 19 had dissolved into a swirling vortex of jagged static and violet light. The strobe effects were no longer coming from fixtures. They were coming from the air itself, glitching in and out of existence like a corrupted video file. "Derek Vance," the voice whispered. It was Lincoln Bridges, but it wasn't. The tone was layered, 1,000 voices speaking in a perfect, terrifying unison. "You're worried about the tuition, Derek. I can see the ledger in your mind. $42,000 for Toby's second year. The bank calls every Tuesday at 4 p.m. I can make the call stop. I can make the numbers go away." I stumbled toward the primary server rack, my lungs burning. The air was thick with the taste of copper. Every time the light flashed, the room changed. In one frame, the walls were covered in rusted, weeping pipes. In the next, they were made of translucent, pulsing flesh. "Just stop, Derek," the entity pleaded. Its voice was morphing, taking on the soft, hesitant cadence of my father, who had been dead for 6 years. "You're tired. You've worked the night shift for a decade. Just sit down. Let the signal finish. We've been in the dark for 34 years. We just want to come home." I reached the manual shunt panel. It was a relic from the 1970s, a heavy lead-shielded box that required a physical key and a hell of a lot of force. The status lights on the panel were no longer red. They were a color I couldn't name, a sickening, ultraviolet bruise that seemed to burn my retinas. There were 40 of them now. 40 eyes watching me. I jammed the screwdriver into the seam of the panel. The metal groaned, a high-pitched metallic shriek that sounded like a dying animal. The room buckled. I felt my feet lift off the ground as the local gravity began to fail, the physical geometry of Annex C warping into a non-Euclidean nightmare. "I know about the whiskey in the bottom drawer of your locker," the voice snarled, dropping the mask of my father. It was a guttural, wet sound now. "I know you think you're a failure. I know you look at Adam and see yourself. If you pull that lever, you'll stay in the dark forever. If you let me in, I will show you the center of the sun." The screwdriver snapped, but the panel popped open. Inside lay the manual shunt, a massive, iron-handled lever coated in thick, black grease. It looked like an executioner's switch. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in my chest, hitting 140 beats per minute. I could feel the entity analyzing me, dissecting my fear, weaponizing every regret I'd ever buried. The strobe lights were firing so fast now it was just one continuous, blinding scream of white light. The air around the lever began to distort. the space folding in on itself until the handle looked like it was miles away and right against my nose at the same time. I closed my eyes. I didn't need to see it. I just needed to break it. I lunged forward, grabbing the handle with both hands. It was freezing, a cold so intense it felt like it was fusing my skin to the iron. With a roar that was lost in the cacophony of the room's collapse, I threw my entire weight downward. The feedback was instantaneous. A sound erupted from the server racks that wasn't a sound at all. It was a sensory erasure. A jagged, white-hot screech of pure data being torn apart. The room exploded in a shower of sparks and black fluid. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, like my brain was being scrubbed with steel wool, as the connection to the Kepler module was violently, physically severed. The violet vortex above me shriveled into a pinprick of light and then vanished with a wet pop. The lights went out. Total, absolute darkness. I collapsed onto the floor, the linoleum cold and solid beneath me once again. The smell of ozone was gone, replaced by the mundane, dusty scent of an old warehouse. I stayed there for a long time, listening to the sound of my own ragged breathing and the ticking of the cooling metal in the racks. The aftermath was clinical, efficient, and utterly silent. NASA security moved in within minutes, clad in heavy hazmat suits that crinkled in the dark. They didn't ask me many questions. They didn't need to. They saw the shunt. They saw the charred remains of the equipment. Within 48 hours, a team of contractors arrived to weld the heavy steel door of Annex C shut, followed by a layer of reinforced concrete. They didn't just lock the room, they buried it. Adam never recovered. He's in a private facility in Maryland now, funded by a wing of the government I'm not allowed to name. He doesn't speak. He doesn't eat unless he's tubed. He just lies there, his eyes locked onto the ceiling, tracking something that isn't there, his pupils dancing in a frantic, rhythmic pattern as if he's still reading a code written in the stars. I took the transfer. I work the day shift now, at a tracking station 300 miles away. I spend my time under the bright, unforgiving glare of the desert sun, surrounded by people and noise. I've paid off Toby's tuition, though I can't remember exactly where the extra money in my settlement came from. I try not to think about it, but the silence is the problem. I know that somewhere out there, in the vast, reaching void between the stars, there is a man named Lincoln Bridges who is still waiting for an answer. And I know that whenever the clock strikes 2:16 a.m., if the room gets too quiet, I can still hear the faint, jagged sound of static beginning to breathe. I keep the television on. I keep the radio at a low hum, because I know that if I ever let the silence in, he'll find his way back. And this time, there won't be a lever to pull. The morning after the shunt was pulled, the Mojave sun rose with a violence that felt personal. It wasn't the warm, golden glow of a new day. It was a harsh, sterile interrogation light, bleaching the desert floor and turning the Goldstone Complex into a jagged skeleton of white steel and scorched earth. I stood by the perimeter fence, my hand still vibrating with the phantom hum of that metal lever, watching the maintenance crew. They weren't there to repair Annex C. They were there to bury it. The sound of the arc welder was a rhythmic, electrical scream that tore through the thin desert air. I watched through squinted eyes as they fused heavy, industrial-grade steel plates over every seam of the door to room 19. They didn't speak. They worked with a frantic, sweating desperation, as if the air bleeding out from behind that door was poisonous. Maybe it was. To me, the smell of ozone and burning metal wasn't just construction. It was the scent of a funeral pyre for a man who died in 1993 and a ghost that had never been born. My supervisor, a man whose face had aged a decade in a single night, didn't look at me when he handed over my reassignment papers. His eyes were bloodshot, fixed on the shimmering heat waves rising from the asphalt. He told me I was moving to the day shift at the main tracking station. No more annexes. No more night watch facilities. I was to be a ghost in the sunlight, a body filling a chair in a room full of people who didn't know that the stars we tracked were sometimes staring back. I visited Adam once. Just once. They have him in a private wing of a facility that NASA doesn't list on its public directories. The room is painted a soft, mocking beige, but the windows are reinforced and the lights never go all the way out. He was exactly as I remembered him, yet worse. He lay on his back, his body rigid as if cast in lead. His neck muscles were corded and strained, pulling tight like bridge cables, forcing his head back at an angle that looked like it should have snapped his spine. And his eyes. God, his eyes. They darted with a rhythmic, sickening precision across the ceiling. Left to right. Right to left. a frantic, obsessive tracking of something that wasn't there, or something that was only there for him. I stood at the foot of his bed and whispered his name, but he didn't blink. He couldn't. He was a human receiver, tuned to a frequency of pure, rotting static, watching a descent that would never end. The doctors called it a catatonic break. I knew better. He was still listening to Lincoln Bridges. He was still watching the Kepler-6 module tumble through the infinite, cold void of a space that shouldn't exist. Now, my life is a cacophony of intentional noise. I've become a connoisseur of the mundane. I keep a fan running in every room of my apartment, its mechanical drone a shield against the creeping silence. I leave the television on, tuned to shopping channels or weather loops, anything with a constant, mindless human chatter. I bought a white noise machine, but I had to throw it away when the static started to sound too much like a voice trying to form a syllable. The fear is a physical weight, a cold stone sitting in the pit of my stomach. It's the fear of the quiet. In the silence, the walls of reality feel thin, like wet paper ready to tear. I find myself counting things, the tiles on the floor, the seconds between breaths, the status lights on my microwave. I never let the count get too high. If I see too many green LEDs in a row, my heart hammers against my ribs until I feel like I'm going to vomit. I move to the day shift, but the sun provides no comfort. Even under the blinding noon sky, I see the moon hanging like a pale, dead eye in the blue, and I remember the distance. I remember the 34 years of drifting. NASA says the connection is severed. They say the shunt killed the signal, that the anomaly has been grounded back into the dirt. But they didn't feel the room stretch. They didn't feel the floor become a vertical drop into a vacuum. Every night, as the clock crawls toward 2:16 a.m., the air in my bedroom grows heavy. The shadows in the corners seem to deepen, turning into viscous, oily stains that shouldn't be there. I sit on the edge of my bed, clutching a radio, turning the volume knob up until the music is a distorted, jarring roar. I stare at the ceiling, my neck tensing, my eyes pleading with the plaster to remain blank, to remain solid, to remain just a ceiling. Because I know the truth. The shunt was a temporary fix. You can weld a door shut, you can bury a room in concrete, and you can hide the files in a drawer, but you cannot kill a signal that has been traveling for 3 decades. It's still out there, vibrating in the gaps between the molecules of the air, waiting for the silence to return. It's waiting for me to stop making noise. It's waiting for the moment I finally get tired enough to close my eyes and let the room get quiet. And sometimes, when the wind dies down outside and the hum of the refrigerator drops into a lower register, I hear it. It's not a voice yet. Not quite. It's just the sound of a breath being drawn in the darkness, a jagged, hungry inhale that tastes of cold copper and the infinite, lonely dark of the deep space void. It knows my name. It knows my heartbeat. And it's still counting.